As you know, there is Blandine that is there for translation. I sent her your note that you sent me. The only thing is remember to speak a bit slowly so she can follow you. And if she needs you to slow down a bit, I will I will interrupt you and mention this to you. Is that all good with you?
Yes.
Okay, I'm introducing everyone in right now. Hello everyone, bonjour tout le monde. My name is Simon Tremblay-Pepin. Je m'appelle Simon Tremblay-Pepin, je suis prof à l'université Saint-Paul à Ottawa. I will do a brief introduction in French so people can know that there is interpretation, and then I'll switch back to English. Pour les personnes qui parlent français, nous avons de l'interprétation simultanée en ce moment aujourd'hui. Pour y avoir accès, vous pouvez cliquer sur le globe tout en bas de votre écran où il est inscrit interprétation, et vous pouvez choisir la langue dans laquelle vous souhaitez que la conférence soit interprétée. Si vous parlez le français, je vous invite à choisir la langue français. Et Blandine, qui est notre interprète aujourd'hui, a la gentillesse de vous aider avec l'interprétation de John Bellamy Foster. So I'll switch back to English now, as everyone can use the interpretation function if they need to. I'm glad to welcome you all to this conference today. This conference is organized by the School of Social Innovation at St. Paul University, as well as the Department of Anthropology and Social Change in San Francisco at the Institute for Integral Studies at San Francisco. We are pleased to have John Bellamy Foster with us today. He will talk about his book, The Return of Nature, that I guess, since it's quite slim, you have all the time to read before this conference. We in the seminar in the PhD of Social Innovation had the time to read it and to discuss it. We are now eager to hear his author talk about it with us today. So without further ado, John, please. It'll be about 30-minute presentation and a 30-minute Q&A. Thank you.
Well, I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm going to talk mainly about how the return of nature was constructed and the general analysis, and then we can maybe get into more specific questions later on. But in 2000, I wrote a book, Marx's Ecology, which was very influential within socialist circles and ecological circles, and really has played a role in changing the debate worldwide in terms of the development of eco-socialism. But in that book, I focused primarily on Marx and thinkers who were associated with Marx or lived in Marx's time, such as Darwin. And I did not go beyond Marx's life itself, except for in the epilogue in the book. And the argument was found to be convincing. I focused on Marx's materialism and why Marx's approach to materialism, which we have to understand at a deeper level, played into ecology and really led him in an ecological direction. And I concentrated a lot on Marx's introduction of the concept of metabolism into social science, the notion of social metabolism, by which he brought ecology for the first time into social science conceptions and into the critique of capitalism. And none of this was questioned. The book, the actual analysis of the book was never questioned. It was pretty clear once it was put before people, but there was a lot of questioning when it came to the issue of relevance and the problem of continuation. That is, it was argued that, well, Marx had all of these fundamental ecological conceptions that are even advanced in relation to our own time. And yet the argument was, well, later socialists and Marxists didn't notice, didn't follow in his path. And so it's all irrelevant, something that's confined to the 19th century. Well, there are obvious answers to that. One answer is that simply because ideas were presented in the 19th century doesn't make them irrelevant to the 21st century. But there was a more fundamental issue, and that is, did the socialist tradition, did the Marxist tradition develop and carry forward ecological analyses? And did Marx and did Engels have an influence on the development of ecology? And one of the problems there is there really aren't very good, there really are not any meaningful histories of ecology and how it developed. They're very truncated. There are discussions of, some people say, well, ecology began with the Romantic poets in England in the 19th century, and then suddenly it jumps to Rachel Carson, maybe with a mention of few developments of ecological science in between, but it's all very truncated. And I think there were reasons for that, I believe. One of the reasons why it's so truncated is because ecology was generated by socialists. The origins of ecology are very closely connected to socialist analysis. And but this was not obvious to people, and there are a number of reasons why it wasn't obvious. And one of these has to do with the problems of Marxism and ecology itself. If you look at the tradition within socialism that developed in the Second International, setting aside both Marx and Engels and looking at what immediately came afterwards in the Second International, there was a very strong tendency to focus simply on labor, simply on working class conditions, understandably enough, and to emphasize the development of production, and to completely exclude ecological issues. It wasn't across the board. For example, Karl Kautsky dealt with the problems of agriculture in ecological ways that were influenced by Marx, but generally the Second International did not deal with those kinds of questions of nature and ecology. It was very productivist. And when Marx wrote the Critique of the Gotha program, he was reacting to some of that. He said in the very first sentence that labor isn't the sole source of wealth. Nature is as well, or nature is even more fundamental in terms of the source of wealth. And yet these kinds of points were discarded. And you have later on the development of Soviet ecology in its early years, particularly under the influence of Lenin. There really was a very powerful ecological analysis in the opening decades of the Soviet Union in the 1920s up till the mid 1930s. And the Soviet Union had the most advanced ecological analysis in the world at that time. And we could point to all sorts of examples of that. There really is no question. But it was extinguished by the mid-1930s. I'll talk about a little bit more about that, but in the Stalin years, the leading ecological thinkers in the Soviet Union were all purged. Some directly executed, others they died in prison. But that tended to bring ecological analysis to a halt. So the Soviet contributions to large extent faded away. In terms of the West, you had the development of critical theory in the 20s and 30s that was in many ways an opposition to Soviet Marxism, in opposition to Soviet Marxism. But when you look at the Frankfurt School and those traditions that arose in the 20s and 30s and actually carried over into the post-Second World War period, they were very neo-Kantian in their philosophical orientation, and also very anti-Soviet. But the neo-Kantianism is important. Basically, they took an epistemological position that the dialectic only applied to society and not to nature. So they rejected Engels's dialectics of nature. And basically, dialectics was the realm of reflexivity within the social historical realm associated with human consciousness, and that we couldn't really, in neo-Kantian terms, we really couldn't understand nature insofar as it went beyond it. It lay beyond human actions, and so nature got set aside. The natural world got set aside as outside of Marxism, and relegated to the realm of natural science, which was no longer seen as related to Marxism, and Marxism in some ways became very anti-natural science, seeing it as inherently positivistic. And so this created huge barriers towards, in the face of ecology, the increasing issues of ecology, the critical theory tradition just was not able to deal with ecology because it had rejected nature and science and the application of dialectics, and so Marxist methods in this realm. So there really was a problem with Marxism and ecology, and Marxism and science. However, that's not the whole story. It's true that in the Soviet Union, the major thinkers were all executed, purged. But in 1931, there was the international. There was the Second International Conference on Science and Technology held in the history of Second International Conference on the History of Science and Technology held in London. And so the one Soviet thinker had been invited to this conference, I think the physicist Zavadovsky, and but they didn't expect anybody to come from the Soviet Union. This was in 1931, international travel was difficult. And suddenly a plane landed at a time when intercontinental transportation was practically unknown. A plane landed from the Soviet Union in the London airport, and out walked Nikolai Bukharin and Nikolai Vavilov and Zavatovsky and Boris Hessen and leading ecological thinkers in the Soviet Union, and they came to this conference on the history of science and technology. And at the conference were some of the leading left figures in Britain within science: Joseph Needham, J.D. Bernal, J.B.S. Haldane, Hyman Levy, Lancelot Hogben, they were almost all there, and other figures. And they were suddenly confronted with a dialectical ecological analysis and a history of science, such as they'd never heard, where social factors entered into it. And they were blown away. And with that began a tradition of Marxist ecological science, really, in Britain. But so this is very complicated. These thinkers were influenced by the scientists who were executed in the Soviet Union. The British tradition, what I refer to as the second foundation, was carried on by thinkers that were influenced by Soviet science, but of a kind of Soviet science that went away. Now, looking at how I approached the whole issue of this in The Return of Nature, I tried to adopt a number of ways of explaining how all of this carried forward, how socialism and ecology came together, and how socialism played a central role in the origins of ecology. But I was also trying to look at it genealogically. I was trying to look at relations to Marx and Engels. So in the beginning of the book, I start off with E. Ray Lancaster, who had a very close relation to Marx, a very close friend of Karl Marx in his later years. And but E. Ray Lancaster was also Charles Darwin and Thomas Huxley's protege, and emerged as the leading scientist in England in the generation after Darwin and Huxley. And he was a close friend of Karl Marx. And I looked at these connections. And of course, what is important here is, Lancaster was not only the greatest biologist in England in the late 19th and early 20th century, but he was also the leading ecological thinker who dealt with ecological crisis, extinction of species, the need for, he called it bionomics, but he helped to introduce the concept of ecology into English language, and he examined nutrient cycling, particularly in the context of marine biology. He was one of the leading microbe hunters in his time, and the first to explain that all modern diseases among both humans and animals were a result of human actions, which he traced to capitalism. He wrote a piece, Man's Effacement of Nature. He was a fundamental ecological thinker, and a very, he was a sort of a Fabian socialist, but an out and out materialist, a strong materialist. And his student, Arthur Tansley, was the thinker who brought the ecosystem concept, introduced the ecosystem concept, and created ecology in our modern sense by giving it this systematic character. And the ecosystem concept was rooted in the concept of metabolism, which Marx had brought into the analysis of society and had used to develop an ecological argument. So you see these things coming forward through a socialist tradition. And Tansley, when he was developing his ecosystem analysis, relied on Hyman Levy's systems theory. Hyman Levy was a Marxist mathematician and scientist, and a leading figure in the story that I tell in The Return of Nature. And Tansley went all the way back to Epicurus and Lucretius, like Marx, to find a material foundation for the concept of ecosystem. So you can see how these things move forward. With the other thinker I deal with early in the book is William Morris. And William Morris represents a powerful tradition. This part of the book is, even though there are 3 chapters devoted to Morris, is not emphasized as much by reviewers of the book as I would like, is not noticed as much. But Morris came out of the Romantic tradition, but out of a radical Romantic tradition. You can think of it in terms of Shelley and John Ruskin, who is a complex figure, but it's certainly a strong critic of the political economy of his day, and who introduced ecological notions via aesthetics into the discussion. And Morris picks up from there. Morris read Marx's Capital just a few months before Marx died. He had already moved in the direction of socialism as a result of Ruskin's influence and his own understanding of labor as alienated. Morris came up with a conception of the alienation of labor independently of Marx. Before Marx's economic and philosophical manuscripts were published, and it was based on an aesthetic view that all art, I mean all labor that is unalienated. He didn't use that actual word, but all labor that's unalienated has art within it. Human beings, if they are laboring in a non-alienated way, will always put art into their work. They will leave traces of themselves in their work. And from this, he developed a critique of labor from aesthetic standpoint that also ended up being ecological critique. He also examined the town and country problem under Marx's influence, and he became the leading socialist activist really in his day. And so working with others like Eleanor Marx, and he developed in his News from Nowhere a kind of a sort of utopian socialism mixed with Marxian realism and ecological thought that was absolutely unique, but was largely discarded until E.P. Thompson brought it back in the 1960s. So Morris is another part of the story, and he brought the Romantic tradition within English thought and criticism together with socialism and ecology, and this influenced later thinkers. So, but the book then focuses a lot on Engels and the dialectics of nature. Engels's dialectics of nature, which is also partly dealt with in his Anti-Düring and in other writings, brought together Darwin's evolutionary theory, Marxian and Hegelian dialectics, and ecology. And the most powerful example of this is the chapter on the part played by labor in the transition from ape to man, where Engels starts with the origins of human beings. In what Stephen Jay Gould said was the most powerful analysis of gene-cultural coevolution in the 19th century, surpassing that of Darwin and Haeckel. And Engels explains how labor played a crucial role and the development of the hands and tools in the emergence of the human species. And later on, it wasn't until halfway into the 20th century that the Australopithecines were recognized as the origin, the earliest human ancestors, and they conformed entirely to Engels's notion of human evolution, and went against what science, what mainstream science had thought up until that time. But Engels went from that, he went from an evolutionary perspective to an ecological, a really deep ecological perspective in the same essay, arguing that we were unintentionally destroying the earth through our social system, our actions, that we would see what he metaphorically referred to as the revenge of nature if we continued to proceed along these lines. So then this all influenced later thinkers. It influenced these red scientists that I talked about. In the 1930s and 40s, ecological ideas exploded. There was a big battle in South Africa because Jan Christian Smuts was probably the most prominent ecological thinker of the time, and he became the head of the British Association. He was a general in South Africa. He was, if you've never heard of Smuts, you may have seen the film Gandhi, and the general that arrests Gandhi is Jan Christian Smuts. Smuts introduced the concept of holism, and it was seen as a ecological conception, and it was giving rise to a new ecological science. But the problem was, it was a very idealist in its orientation, and it was rooted in an ecological racism. So he created these notions of hierarchies within his holism, with whites representing the top of the pyramid, and it was all a justification. It was an ecological view, but it was also a justification of racism and apartheid. The person who coined the word holism was Jan Christian Smuts, but the person who coined the word apartheid was also Jan Christian Smuts. And Lancelot Hogben, as a young man, a scientist in the British Association, met in South Africa, and they wanted to have a debate on the nature of life. And so they wanted somebody to debate Smuts. So they came up with Lancelot Hogben, who was kind of a courageous individual, and they put him up against Smuts, and they had this incredible debate about idealism versus materialism with respect to ecology and life. And at the same time this was going on, Smuts, of course, Smuts was introducing apartheid along with others in South Africa. And the Hogben and his wife Annette Charles were part of the resistance, and they were smuggling people, they were smuggling Blacks out of South Africa who would otherwise be killed. Annette Charles actually drove a car across much of the country with two Black men who were going to be lynched in the trunk. The theory was that they wouldn't stop a white woman. They wouldn't believe a white woman would have Blacks escaping apartheid justice in her trunk. And Hogben set up a secret compartment in his kitchen to under the floor, as a safe place in the process of smuggling the Black activists out of South Africa and away from Smuts justice. So all these things of ecology were connected, where debates over materialism and idealism over ecology and racism. Hogben went back to London, and he started working because he was so outraged by what was going on in South Africa. He was a great geneticist. He started working on attacking the genetic theory of race. And he basically destroyed it along with J.B.S. Haldane, another Marxist scientist. They went after the genetic conception of race and completely took it apart. That was the beginning of the end of the biological race category in science. The final blow was carried out by Richard Lewontin in the United States in the 1970s, part of the same tradition of Marxian science and ecology. So you get some idea of what was going on. There were other figures at the time. H.G. Wells and Julian Huxley wrote The Science of Life. They were very close to Lancaster. They were both students of Lancaster. They were very close to Hogben and to some of the other British scientists. And people like Needham, they introduced, based on Engels, the notion of integrative levels, or the way they talked about emergence. The notion that we could have a materialist dialectical ecological view by recognizing that everything in life is self-organizing and reaches different organizational levels or integrative levels with different emergent powers. So you didn't need teleology, you didn't need God, you didn't need final causes, you didn't need idealism. You could explain the world in materialist ecological terms itself, rooting this in ecology. J.B.S. Haldane, who was one of the great Marxist ecologists, was also one of the two leading figures in England in the development of the modern Darwinian synthesis. And so one of the characteristics of this work was they were all influenced by Romanticism, but they were also all these thinkers were also influenced by both Darwin and Marx. The only place in the world where you had major thinkers who were the leading thinkers on both Marx and Darwin at the same time, and they saw them as related. And so,
maybe in conclusion,
yeah. So you had I'll say just a few. You had Christopher Caldwell, who, coming out of more of a Morris tradition and a literary tradition, brought together science and art and dialectics and ecology in his late 20s before he died at age 29 in the Spanish Civil War. After these, all of these figures were influential through the 1930s and 40s, but afterwards, when the Cold War set in, they were all targeted. And but they all found ways of continuing to fight. They mostly focused on peace and ecology, and turned their efforts directly in that direction. Needham went to became the leading sinologist in England. Haldane went to India, but they Bernal became the leading figure in the anti-nuclear movement. So they all found ways to continue the struggle, even during the Cold War, even when they were targeted. And this tradition then carries on into the rise of the ecology movement in the 1960s. Most of the leading figures like Rachel Carson's and Barry Commoner, who were really got the ecology movement going from within science, were directly and indirectly influenced by these thinkers that we're talking about. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We will now go to selections of questions. We have about 30 minutes in front of us. You can use the raise your hand the raise your hand function at the bottom of your screen to ask question. We'll start with a first question from Nadine.
Thank you for your presentation. It's very interesting. In our seminar, we read your book under the theme of protection. In that context, what do you think we are protecting, from whom or what, and how?
Well, I think we're trying to protect life. And I should say that Haldane, JBS Haldane was, along with other thinkers in the Soviet Union, was JBS Haldane is noted as being the main theorist of the origins of life and on a materials foundation, and that was really critical to the development of ecology. Rachel Carson started there when she talked about ecology, when she introduced the concept to the public, the general public. And so, the ecology starts with a notion of the origins of life. And it's all about life. It's about the biosphere. It's about the Earth system. And what we're trying to protect is life itself. And at the end of his life, J.D. Bernal wrote a book called The Origins of Life, where he was building on Haldane's work and others, and he ended it with a statement about that we have to, that life is now generally threatened on Earth, and we have to do the things necessary to protect it. And of course, he was referring in particular to nuclear war and the prospect of nuclear war, which, if you've been watching the news in the last few weeks, is not really something that should be out of sight and out of mind. But we also know now a lot more about how we're creating rifts in the Earth system that are disrupting the biogeochemical cycles of the planet and endangering all of life, including our own. And climate change is an example of that. So this analysis helps us to understand that. And I think it helps us to understand it because these thinkers were not just narrow scientists, just looking at nature removed from society. And they weren't narrow, we're not talking about narrow social scientists who are looking just at society aside from nature. These were thinkers who brought it all together, very much in the Marxist tradition. And I think this is what we need to protect life. We have to understand how society interacts with the natural world, how our society is, and in very dangerous and disruptive ways.
Thank you. We'll go now to Alexa.
Thanks for the presentation and the answers. I have a question: what is the role and place of aesthetic and technological questions in today's eco-socialist struggles, given your discussion about technology and aesthetics?
Well, yeah, it's hard to bring the two together. Well, let's say, let's start with technology. Technology is historical. It has to be understood as historical. It arises in particular social systems and is developed for particular ends. In our society, the technologies that are developed and the way they're utilized really have to do with capitalism. So we have all sorts of technologies. We have technologies that would allow us to reduce our impact on the earth. For example, we're all, just basically, we're constantly improving the efficiency with which we use natural inputs, matter and energy, how we utilize them in production. And yet we use those efficiencies in order to expand the system, in order to generate profits, in order to accumulate, rather than for purposes of conservation. So, because conservation is alien to capitalism, any meaningful conservation, because it's an expansive system, not a system that conserves. So that's a kind of a there are a lot more to say about technology. We need technologies to solve the problem, but the solutions are not all technological. In fact, we have to start with our social relations. In terms of aesthetics, aesthetics is one way of understanding the intrinsic value of nature, as we sometimes say. It's we have to, how do we understand nature and the human relation to nature that is connected to the senses and to notions of beauty. The original conception of aesthetics in Germany, which influenced Marx and also more indirectly Morris, was that aesthetics was the realm of the senses. So aesthetics was all about our sensuous relationship to nature. That's how aesthetics originated. And I think we have to get back to that notion that aesthetics can be and should be very ecological. It should be connecting us to the world around us rather than separating us. And of course, aesthetics, sometimes in our aesthetics, we express alienation, but it should be critical in the sense that we want to transcend it and transcend the alienation of humanity and the alienation of nature, and get back to more of a unity between nature and humanity, and within humanity itself. It's all connected. This is really powerfully expressed in Caldwell at various times, probably more powerfully than anybody else certainly dealt with in the book. And so he always wanted to bring together art and science, aesthetics and ecology. And at the beginning of chapter 10, I have a quote from him: "Social relations must be changed so that love returns to the earth." But he could, and it would very much in the spirit of Caldwell to say also so that beauty returns to the earth. And so aesthetics is really quite fundamental.
And it's interesting that often in our debates we link aesthetic to kind of a bourgeois seeing of what the struggle should be. But I won't go farther on this. I'll let Roger Rachi ask his question.
Yes, very interesting presentation, Mr. Foster. It's a pleasure to hear you. I have a question. You've done a lot to sort of revalidate Engels and the dialectics of nature, and in a certain sense move away from the influence of Lukács and his sort of division between social science and natural science. Yet at the same time, I think you've written about Lukács and you've expressed admiration for Lukács's work. How do you match that? How do you make that work in a synthesized framework?
Well, it's actually fairly simple, but let me start with my own background before I answer the question directly. I mean, when I first started studying critical theory, I'd been introduced to it in the early 1970s and studied Meseros and Marx. But when I started studying critical theory at York University in Toronto, the first thing that they told you when you came into the class was that dialectics has no relation to nature. It's the ultimate principle of, it was built into the Frankfurt School. It's built into critical theory, and basically they justified that a bit in terms of Lukács, in terms of his history of class consciousness. But in terms of footnote 6 of History and Class Consciousness, which is about 40 or 50 words long, and they said, well, that's Lukács' critique of Engels, and he rejects the dialectics of nature. But Lukács was rejecting some specific way in which Engels had approached it, or what he thought at the time. But if you look at elsewhere in the book, even in History and Class Consciousness, Lukács didn't reject the dialectics of nature. Later on in the book, he says there is such a thing as he sees the dialectics of nature as kind of a preliminary form of, he calls the merely, he refers to it in terms of merely the dialectics of nature. That is, there's a higher dialectics to do with society, but there's also a kind of more fundamental dialectics of nature, or and a less developed dialectics that applies to the natural world. That's part of History and Class Consciousness, but the footnote actually then became the basis of Western Marxism. In some ways, Western Marxism came to be defined in terms of the rejection of the dialectics of nature. Lukács didn't actually ever go along with that, and then we now have the Taylism document just a few years later, where he's talking all about the dialectics of nature. But it was a problem for him because he came out of a neo-Kantian tradition. And the way he solved it was how? He solved it by focusing on Marx's concept of labor as metabolism. He said, well, this is where the dialectics of nature really enters in, through human activity, through human production as social metabolism. And then it becomes possible for us to relate to the natural world dialectically because we are doing it through our production and the process. And then he adds to that especially in his 1967 introduction to the History and Class Consciousness, he explains also that in our science, in our experiments, we interact with nature in various ways that allow us to transcend some sort of absolute barrier between human society and nature, which doesn't make any sense at all, because we ourselves are part of nature. We're corporeal beings. He understood that, and he keeps on working that. So when you get to his social ontology at the very end of his life, I mean, if you read the 3 volumes are published in English, the Marx, the Hegel, and the labor books, they're all about metabolism and about social ontology as this dialectical connection between human beings and nature. So the trouble with the way Lukács is treated is that there were basically 3 periods in his life, maybe more, but the most fundamental ones were his pre-Marxist period, when he was explicitly neo-Kantian, then his Marxist period, which came just before the Hungarian Revolution, and then his I mean, then it's his original encounter with Marx and Hegel with tactics and ethics, and then he moves on to history and class consciousness. And but in his later stage, he goes beyond that. I mean, he was still a young man when he wrote History and Class Consciousness, and he lived until the 1970s. And in all that time, he's developing quite centrally an ontological perspective that incorporates metabolism and sees social ontology as connected to the dialectics of nature, not entirely in Engels' sense, but in a way that comes more directly out of Marx, and certainly overlapped in some areas with Engels. And of course, I also was friends with István Mészáros, who was a younger colleague of Lukács, and we talked about this. My own approach was developed independently, but we completely overlapped in terms of our interpretation of Lukács in this area. I hope that helps.
It certainly does. Thank you so much, Professor. A last question before we go, because I know you have a meeting. You end your book by saying that we must dethrone today as the idol of capitalism itself, the concentrated power of class-based avarice, which may now imperils the ecology of the earth. This is the meaning of freedom as necessity and the return to nature in our time. Lancaster saw the educability of humanity as the key over 100 years ago. How do you suggest that where we should be going about doing what you propose at the end of your book?
It's hard to say because we have to operate at a lot of different levels. I had a friend who wrote me a letter recently, listened to the Deutscher lecture I gave on the return of nature, and he said, well, somebody on the right could just put a clip at the bottom saying, you're only talking to yourself, and it's all jargon. And of course, the sort of thing that the right wing does, right? Very anti-intellectualism. But it made me think, how do we deal with these things? In the book, and even more in that lecture, I was trying to talk about the foundations of Marxism and socialism, explain how it was actually integrated in its materialism, which we've forgotten about, was integrated from the very beginning with an ecological conception. And that this is a way to get back to the roots of socialism, historical materialism, what kind of society we should be aiming for, the nature of the struggle that we should be engaged in, what kind of revolution we need in terms of an ecological and social revolution, all of them. So I'm trying to get at those issues, but it was at a, kind of a high theoretical plane that reaches out to some parts of the left. But I also think, we have to work at a lot of different planes in terms of our communication, our education, our activism. I've just written an article that's coming out in May about nuclear war. It's actually takes off from E.P. Thompson's notes from exterminism. So it's entitled Notes on Exterminism for the 21st Century Ecology and Peace Movements. It's very concrete because nuclear war is fairly concrete. But I write about, I've written several articles lately about the attempts to financialize the planet, the turning natural capital into a commodity, and as a solution to the environmental problem offered by the mainstream, but actually extremely dangerous and destructive to the earth. So I write a lot. I have a book coming out called Capitalism in the Anthropocene, about the ecological crisis, how we deal with it, how we can kind of build our movements. And so I'm trying to operate at a lot of different levels to create a coherent theory and praxis that we can use in our time. And then there are other people who are more activists and more involved in direct activism and organization than I am, and who are people all over the world. We have to be able to develop ideas in our theory and our analysis that actually can be brought down to the level of praxis, of activism, of engaging in and changing the world. It may seem, the quote you gave, we have to dethrone the power of capital itself. That may seem like a very big project. It is, but look at where we are right now. We're facing more than one existential threat to the existence of humanity. And if we go on the way we are, it's pretty clear that we will now destroy the earth as a home for humanity. We'll destroy ourselves. I think that's what the science says. So how do we bring our analysis of society and of change together with this science to create a vision and a movement and an activism and forms of organization that do what is necessary? And I don't actually think that we can, I don't think there's any guarantee we're going to win. Just looking at nuclear war, if we make the wrong step, it can be fairly instantaneous and complete with nuclear winter. There's no guarantee that we'll be able to stop climate change at a level that will secure our future. There are all sorts of dangers now, but one thing I do know is that humanity is going to be struggling over this, and humanity is not going to give up. Human beings are not going to give up. That hundreds of millions, maybe billions of people are going to enter into this struggle to save humanity and the earth. And we just have to join with them and do as much as we can with all of our skills and methods. I mean, we need aesthetic answers. We need music and art. We need new science. We need new history in the domain of knowledge. But we also need people who can bring this to the earth and to the population and to communicate. And so that's just the struggle before us. It's really the greatest struggle humanity has ever faced, because freedom, in the sense of creating a society of substantive equality and ecological sustainability, all that is necessity. And it also corresponds to the development of human freedom. We're at a point in history where the struggle for freedom and struggle for necessity are the same thing, partly because of what Marx said or pointed to, although he didn't see the situation we're in, obviously, that it ultimately came down to a question of ruin or revolution. Thank you.
Well, John Bellamy Foster, it was a pleasure having you with us today and an honor. Thank you so much for writing this book. I know it was a long journey, and thank you for being with us today. And thank you for everyone who joined in. Have a good day, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you.